408, Nehemiah 13. If you don't have a Bible, raise your hand. One will magically make its way to you, I'm sure. Nehemiah chapter 13. Now, last week, of course, we looked at Nehemiah chapter 12. And if you were here for that service, you may remember what a wonderfully uplifting and inspiring chapter that was. We saw the work on the walls of Jerusalem, which is really the thing that's been driving the narrative of Nehemiah so far. That was finished, finally. And the people of Jerusalem could celebrate, and they could dedicate their work to God, and they could thank him for his amazing faithfulness. And it was a really uplifting and joyful way to end the book. Or at least it would be if we didn't have chapter 13 after it. The people of Jerusalem go into this chapter with so much promise and so much expectation and so much joy, so much love for God, and then everything seems to just go wrong. They had promised to commit themselves to God, they'd promised to live for him, but here they fail. The book of Nehemiah ends with failure. A few weeks ago as well, we looked at chapter 10. And if you remember that was like chapter 12, a very rousing and inspiring chapter. In chapter 10, the people, they recommit themselves to their covenant with God. And they promised once again to keep his commandments and to live for him. If you just turn back to chapter 10 for a second, just on page 406, you'll see in verse 30 of chapter 10, they say, "We will not give our daughters to the people of the land or take their daughters for our sons." This is all the people of Jerusalem promising this. The next verse, 31, they say, "And if the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day." And then in verses 32 through to the end of that chapter, they rededicate themselves to providing for God's temple and the Levites who were serving there. And the chapter ends with them saying, "We will not neglect the house of our God." So back in chapter 10, the Jews of Jerusalem, they promised not to marry into the nations around them. They promised to keep the Sabbath day holy. They promised to provide for God's temple. And then in chapter 13, they break every single one of those promises. So we have Jewish men marrying foreign women and being led astray into sin. We have merchants from nations that aren't Israel coming into Jerusalem to trade and work with Jews on the Sabbath, on the day of rest. And then we find that the Levites, who were meant to be serving God in the temple, they have to go out of the city and farm to fend for themselves because God's work isn't being provided for. And whilst all this is starting, Nehemiah himself is not in Jerusalem. So in verse 6, he tells us that he'd been called back to the Persian king. He calls him the king of Babylon. That's really just an honorary title. He's been called away, and then he comes back. And when he does come back to Jerusalem, he discovers this mess and sets about quite desperately, really, trying to put everything right. And we'll see as we look through this chapter that Nehemiah, he acts as a kind of foil to the rest of Israel. He's the opposite to them. So he shows us the right way while they show us the wrong way. And they fail in this chapter. God's people can and do fail to live for him. In the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul encourages us to live lives worthy of the calling we have received. But we so often fail to do this. And so this is our subject for this evening. It's when God's people fail. And as we look at this chapter, we're going to see that failure often comes about when we forget. So we fail when we forget certain things. And this is going to make up our first few headings this evening. So first we're going to see that God's people fail when we forget what sin is. We fail when we forget who we are. And we fail when we forget our weakness. So first of all then, God's people fail when we forget what sin is. The first thing that Nehemiah discovers when he comes back to Jerusalem is that Tobiah the Ammonite has been living in the temple. Now, this character Tobiah, we came across him first much earlier in Nehemiah, back in chapter 4. When he'd been actively working against Nehemiah and against the people of Jerusalem as they were rebuilding the walls. So back in chapter 4, we read, "But when Sanballat and Tobiah," this is the same Tobiah, and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. So this Tobiah was the enemy of Israel. And here he is in this chapter living in what is supposed to be its most holy and special building. This situation is ridiculous. It's absurd. This is Israel's enemy. This is the one who had actively worked against them, living in their most precious and important building. To try and think of an illustration, imagine if halfway through World War II, Adolf Hitler had been given a bedroom at Buckingham Palace. Right? It's that kind of ridiculousness. This man is the enemy. He does not belong here. Now, this situation is ridiculous, but this ridiculousness, it acts as quite a powerful picture for the ridiculousness and out-of-placeness of sin in the Christian life. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians that we are God's temple. Christians are God's temple. And sin is the enemy. Sin has no rightful place in the Christian life. It does not belong there. And when we sin as Christians, especially when we have persistent and repeated sin that isn't dealt with, it's like Tobiah the Ammonite living in the temple. It's like Adolf Hitler living in Buckingham Palace. It does not fit. It's wrong. But what is perhaps maybe even more worrying in this chapter, in Nehemiah 13, is not just that this sin is there, but it's how it gets in the first place. So in verse 4, we read that one of the priests, called Eliashib, was related to Tobiah. Now, that phrase in the Hebrew, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that these two men were family. They could have just been friends. They could have been associated with each other. But the point is that this priest, Eliashib, he let Tobiah into the temple because he was familiar with him, because he was friendly with him, because he had forgotten that this man was the enemy. And in a similar way, sin creeps into the Christian life when it becomes familiar, when we become comfortable with it, when we forget that sin is the enemy. And this creeping in, it can be subtle, it can be hard to notice because it starts deep within us. It starts deep within our hearts, within our thoughts. So just to take an imaginary example here, let's say that you get passed over for a promotion at work and it goes to one of your colleagues. And you feel hard done by this. You feel a little bit jealous of that person who got the job. And you justify how you feel because you think, well, I've worked hard. I deserve this recognition. And you tell yourself that jealousy you're feeling, that it's not wrong, it's not a problem. You forget God's commandment not to covet, not to be jealous. And you let this sin in. And this jealousy, this sin, it starts to grow and it starts to fester and it turns into a kind of resentment. And you start seeing other ways in which this person, this colleague, has been given things maybe that you think they don't deserve, and it makes you angry. And that turns to hate, and you start to hate them, and eventually you're acting in ways to undermine them and to make them look bad. Well, that's just one example, but hopefully it demonstrates that if we become familiar with sin, if we forget what it is, if we forget that it is the enemy, if we let it in, if we let it take root, then it will grow and it will fester. And we see that in this passage. So in verse 5, we read that this man, Tobiah, he was living in the room in the temple where the offerings and the tithes used to be kept. So this was the room where the Levites' food was meant to be kept. The Levites were the ones who served God in the temple. And the other people of Israel were meant to give offerings to sustain them as they worked. And this was the room where those offerings were meant to be kept. But because this man Tobiah had been allowed to live in that room, there was no more space for the offerings, and so people stopped bringing them. And we read in verse 10 further down that Nehemiah finds that the Levites have had to go out into the farms and into the fields outside Jerusalem to fend for themselves because they weren't being provided for. And the entire system of temple worship starts to break down and is disrupted. So God's worship is being neglected, and the people of Israel are sinning further by neglecting it, all because this priest Eliashib had forgotten that Tobiah was the enemy. And this kind of downward spiral that we see here, it takes some radical intervention to fix it. And that's what Nehemiah tries to do. He literally throws Tobiah out of the temple and all of his furniture with him in verse 8. And then in verse 9, he has all of the rooms that Tobiah had stayed in cleansed. And then further down in verse 13, he appoints these treasurers to ensure that offerings are being brought to support the Levites and that temple worship can go ahead as it was supposed to. It's a very dramatic and sudden turnaround. But Nehemiah sees Tobiah for the enemy that he really is. He sees sin for the enemy it really is. He sees it as a threat, and he casts it out, literally in this case. And of course, this image of Tobiah being thrown out of the temple, it's very similar, isn't it, to something that Jesus did in his life and ministry, where he came to Jerusalem. He came to the same temple and found it overrun with merchants and moneylenders, and he physically drove them out. In John's account of the story, Jesus even makes a whip and physically drives them out of the temple. He drove sin out of that temple forcefully because it did not belong there. And as we were seeing this morning, Jesus uses some similarly quite, if we're honest, violent and forceful imagery to describe the action we should take against sin in our own lives. So we had this verse this morning. Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Sin has no place in the Christian life. It is the enemy. So it needs to be removed. It needs to be thrown out. And that removal, that surgery, if you want to use that image, it can be painful, it can be costly, it can be difficult. It can mean that we lose things. It can mean that we lose hobbies or places or even relationships that are damaging to us. But this removal is better done sooner rather than later, because the longer we leave it before taking action against sin in our lives, the more familiar we become with it, the more comfortable we get with it, the deeper we allow it to take root, the harder and the more painful it will be to remove it. So the longer you go on feeling jealous of that colleague at work, the longer you go on gossiping about that person in church, or the more you keep watching that television show which you know deep down you shouldn't really be watching, the more familiar we become with these things, the harder it is to stop them. But thank God that with his help it is not impossible, because with God all things are possible. But we do see here that God's people fail when we forget what sin is, when we forget that sin is the enemy. Secondly, then, God's people fail when we forget who we are. The second problem that Nehemiah has to deal with when he returns to Jerusalem is that the people have forgotten the special place of the Sabbath day. They've been mistreating the Sabbath. Now, if you've been here in our morning services, we've been going through the Ten Commandments, and a few weeks ago we went through the Sabbath in our series on the Ten Commandments. And one of the things that we saw then was that the Sabbath was meant to be a sign of the covenant, of the relationship between God and the people of Israel. It was something that was meant to set them apart from the nations around them and make them distinctive. So God says to Israel in Exodus chapter 31, he says, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. That means set you apart, make you holy. So the Sabbath was meant to be a sign of the people's relationship with God. It was meant to be that the Jews would rest on the Sabbath day, that they wouldn't work, whilst all of the other nations worked around them. The Sabbath was meant to be a sign that the Jews were distinct from other people, set apart by God to be a holy nation. And back in chapter 10 of Nehemiah, the Jews had even specifically promised on this point that when people from other nations came to them on the Sabbath to work, to trade with them, that they wouldn't do it, that they wouldn't buy from them. And yet here we have them in our chapter doing exactly that. So they're not being distinct, they're not being separate, and they're not being different from the peoples around them. Here they are acting in exactly the same way as those foreign merchants who come through the gates of Jerusalem to trade. They've lost their distinctiveness. They've forgotten who they are. Well, Christians, too, we are called to be holy. We are called to be visibly different from the people around us. So Peter says to us, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. We are meant to be distinctive as Christians, and that distinctiveness is meant to declare God's praises, to glorify him. But sin, when it takes root in the lives of Christians, it destroys that distinctiveness, and it robs God of his glory. So here's just an illustration to demonstrate this. Say, for example, you work for a company and one of the managers at that company, who isn't a Christian, they get caught stealing money from the till or from the company's bank account. Right? That's a bad thing. That's theft. Right? That person's a thief. But now, change that example slightly. Imagine that it's not a company, it's a church, and it's not a manager, it's an elder. So an elder of the church is caught stealing money from the church's bank account. Now, that's the same sin in a way. That's still theft, but it feels worse somehow, doesn't it? Because whilst they might be doing exactly the same thing that the manager was doing, that person is one of God's people. Someone chosen by God to be a part of God's holy nation and to proclaim his glory, but they've forgotten that. They've forgotten who they are. So God's people fail when we forget who we are, but that doesn't just have to take the form of obvious sin like that, obvious sin like stealing. If an elder steals money from the church, the whole world can point at them and say, yes, that's wrong. We agree that that's wrong. But take a very different example. Say now if a church or a church's leadership comes out and says, we support a woman's right to have an abortion. Well, then the world will turn and say, oh, that's very progressive of you. The world won't see that as wrong. The world won't see that as sin. But the church has still lost its distinctiveness. It's still forgetting that it's been called by God to be set apart. And as we were seeing in our service in the morning last week, that position that it's taken is still wrong, and it's still sinful, and it's still unbiblical. Now, coming back to our passage, these foreign merchants coming into Jerusalem to trade on the Sabbath, obviously they didn't have a problem with trading on the Sabbath day. They didn't see that what the Jews was doing was wrong, but it was wrong because the Jews were breaking God's law. They'd forgotten their distinctiveness. Our standard of what it means to be holy, what it means to be set apart, what it means to be distinctive, it shouldn't be to do with what the world says, but with what God says. Because after all, God is the one who calls us out to be holy. So we don't just fail when we do things that the world says are wrong. We fail when we do the things that God says are wrong. Being distinctive as a Christian doesn't mean living up to the standards that the world sets for us. It means living up to the standards that God sets for us. And if we are trying to live up to the world's standards and not God's, then we've forgotten who we are. We have forgotten that we are called. We have forgotten that we are meant to be set apart. We've forgotten that we are meant to be holy, and we have failed. But again, we see in our passage that Nehemiah himself, he doesn't fall for this trap. He remembers who the Jews are. He remembers who they're meant to be. He remembers that they're meant to be set apart and special and distinctive. And so again, he takes some radical steps to reaffirm this distinctiveness. And again, it's pretty dramatic stuff. So first, he confronts the Jewish nobles, and he challenges them about what they're doing, allowing people to trade on the Sabbath. And then he goes and he commands that the gates of the city should be shut on the Sabbath day to stop all of these foreign merchants coming in to trade. And then later on, when he finds some of those same merchants camping outside the city walls, he threatens to arrest them if they won't leave. Like, it's quite radical, dramatic stuff. But it shows us, doesn't it, the need for boldness in confronting this kind of sin and forgetfulness when it appears in the church. Boldness in confronting it, regardless of what the world might think. Because I'm sure these foreign merchants, they didn't understand what Nehemiah was doing. How could they? It wouldn't have made any sense to them why the Jews weren't supposed to be trading on one day of the week. And in fact, they might have even been quite angry because Nehemiah was robbing them of a day's worth of profits. Well, when the church forgets its distinctiveness, when it forgets what it's supposed to be, when it starts to conform to the world rather than conforming to the image of Christ, it needs people like Nehemiah to be bold and to remind it and to tell it where it has gone wrong and where it has failed. But on the other hand, when the church does remember, when it does take a stand, when it does remember that it is meant to be holy and set apart, the world might look on and not understand, or the world might even be angry. I briefly used the example of abortion earlier, partly because last week we were challenged, I think, quite strongly in our morning service about this specific issue. And yes, of course, we must be proclaiming the gospel first. And this is a complicated issue, and it requires compassion and love. But it is a subject where the church is called to be distinctive and to take a stance which many people in the world will look on and be furious. But if we allow their anger, if we allow the anger of the world to determine, to decide what we do and what we say as Christians, then we have forgotten who we are. We have forgotten that we are set apart by God to be his holy people. So, God's people fail when we forget that sin is the enemy, when we forget that God has set us apart. Thirdly, we fail when we forget our weakness. The third thing that Nehemiah has to deal with when he comes back to Jerusalem is all of the problems that have been caused by Jews marrying people from the nations around them. And this, again, is an issue that we've looked at before in our studies on Nehemiah back in chapter 10. The problem we saw then, the problem with Israel marrying into these nations around them, it wasn't to do with race or nationalism or anything like that. It was a spiritual issue. And we don't have time this evening to get into all the details of why that was, but the short version is that it was feared that by marrying into these nations, the Jews would be drawn away from God and led to worshipping idols and the false gods of the nations around them. That's the short version. And we do start to see the beginnings of this in chapter 13. So if you take a look at verse 4, we read that because Jewish men, verse 24, because Jewish men had been marrying and having children with non-Jewish women, that half of the children being born in Jerusalem couldn't speak the language of Judah and could only speak the language of Ashdod. So in other words, their children couldn't speak Hebrew, basically is what that's saying. Now, why is that a problem? Well, think about it for a second. How was it that the Jews were supposed to know God and to keep his law? Well, it was through their scriptures, wasn't it? And what language were those scriptures written in? Well, it was Hebrew. So losing the Hebrew language, it wasn't just a case of losing culture or losing heritage. It was going to result in generations of Jewish children growing up not knowing God because they couldn't understand his word. So this was a serious spiritual issue, and Nehemiah sees that. And again, he confronts the people about it. He even, in verse 25, goes so far as to beat them and to pull out their hair. It's pretty extreme. And I don't want to get bogged down in Nehemiah pulling out people's hair this evening, as interesting as that would be to talk about. I want to focus more on what he actually says to them. So first of all, in verse 25, he makes them swear an oath that they won't keep marrying into these nations around them. And then in verse 26, he says, "Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women?" So marrying foreign women. "Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women?" So the people that Nehemiah is talking to, they seem to be a little bit complacent about their sin. In other words, they don't see it as a problem. But Nehemiah turns to them and says, no, it is a problem what you're doing. And he uses the example of Solomon. Solomon, he says, Israel's wisest king, a man who was loved by God, a man of faith even, was led into sin when he married foreign women like this. And if Solomon wasn't strong enough to resist being led astray by this sin, then what makes you think, Nehemiah says, that you are strong enough? These people had forgotten their own weakness. They thought they could resist temptation. They thought they could sin so far and then no further. So they walked headlong into sin, headlong into temptation, and were overcome by it. They had thought that they were stronger than Solomon, but they weren't. And when it comes to resisting temptation, none of us is as strong as we think we are. We are all born with sin in our hearts, and none of us is immune to it. The Bible is full of stories of people who loved God and served God and were committed to him and were great heroes of the faith. But with the sole exception of Jesus Christ, not one of them lived a life that was free from sin. Even after we are saved, even after we are redeemed by the blood of Jesus, we are still, in ourselves, weak. We still have that sinful nature in us. And if we forget that weakness, and if we walk headlong into sin and temptation without a second thought, we will be overcome by it, and we will fall into sin, and we will fail. So, there is no getting around the fact that this chapter of Nehemiah is pretty bleak. And I haven't really tried to hide that so far. This chapter presents us with a very negative view of God's people. And we see their failure. We see our failure on full display here. But there are some glimmers in here of something a bit more hopeful. And so I want to finish with just two more very brief points relating to that. So we've seen that we fail to live for God when we forget that sin is the enemy, when we forget that we have been called by God to be holy and to be set apart, and when we forget our own weakness in the face of temptation. But now I want to think about just two things briefly that God remembers. And the first of those is that God remembers when we please him. You might have noticed that each of the sections in this chapter 13, it ends with a short prayer from Nehemiah. So first of all, in verse 14, Nehemiah asks God to remember him and not to wipe out the good deeds that he's done for him concerning the temple. Then later on in verse 22, Nehemiah prays again, and he asks God to remember what he's done concerning the Sabbath day and to spare him from judgment according to his steadfast love. And then later in verse 29, Nehemiah asks God to remember them being the priests who had married the enemies of God's people. And Nehemiah wants God to remember them because he wants justice, essentially. And then at the very end of the chapter, we end with a sort of summary prayer, remember me, O my God, for good. So what are we meant to make of these prayers? Because it can seem like Nehemiah is being a bit arrogant. I don't know if you thought that when you read it. Is he being proud? Is he boasting about what he's done? Because it can seem that way to us reading it. I don't think that is what's going on here. And let me explain why. Nehemiah does what he does in this chapter, brings about all of his reforms, challenges the people because he is trying to please God. He wants to bring the people back in line with God's law. He wants to ensure that they keep the promise that they made to him. He is acting in God's name here. He's acting for God, and he recognizes that in prayer, not to glorify himself, not to big himself up, but to acknowledge God in what he's doing, because he is trying to please God. Paul says something kind of similar in 2 Corinthians, where he says, so whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him, to please God. Our aim as God's people, our aim as Christians should be to please him, to please God. And this is something which we can do. Despite our weaknesses, despite our sin, despite our failure, we can please God. So Psalm 147 says, if we'll come up, yeah. But the Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, in those who hope in his steadfast love. God takes pleasure in us. He is pleased with us when we fear him, when we hope in his love. If we love God, if we act and live by faith, we can do things that are good and that please God. Not that they earn our salvation, but they do please God. And I think Nehemiah knows this. His prayers, they're not meant as arrogant boasts about the things that he's done in his own strength. They are appeals to God to remember the things that he has done in faith. He is not relying, Nehemiah, on his own efforts to justify him, to make him right with God. And he says as much in verse 22, where he says in the second half of verse 22, "Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love." So Nehemiah is relying on the greatness of God's steadfast love to save him and to justify him, not on his own efforts. And this is faith. This is real faith in action. And it's only because Nehemiah is acting in faith here that he is able to please God. We can please God, but we can only do this in faith. The letter to the Hebrews flips this around and shows us the opposite of it, where the writer says, without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So if Nehemiah had not been acting in faith, he would not have been able to please God. But because he was acting in faith, because he believed in God, because he believed in God's goodness and in God's steadfast love, because he was seeking God, because he was seeking God's justice, because he was seeking God's glory, because he wanted to see God's will being done in the people around him, he could pray with confidence, "Remember me, remember what I have done, because these works, these things I have done, they're not really my works at all. They are yours, God." Nehemiah's works aren't really his works. They are God's works. And he could be confident that God would remember him and that God would be pleased with him and reward him because he was acting in faith. Yes, we do fail to live for God frequently. But when we act in faith, when we act in real faith that trusts in and relies on God's goodness and steadfast love, God is pleased. And God is pleased because when we act in faith, in a way, it's not really us acting at all, but it's Jesus Christ acting in us and acting through us. We sang a song earlier that alluded to these words in Paul's letter to the Galatians. "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." It's not us doing it. It is Jesus Christ doing it through us. And this brings us on to our final, very brief point this evening. Yes, God's people can and we do fail. And often this is because we've forgotten something crucial about ourselves or about God or about sin. But when we act in faith, Christ acts through us and God is pleased. And God is pleased ultimately because he remembers not our sin and our failures, but what Jesus has done. God remembers what Jesus Christ has done. We cannot please God by relying on our own strength. And if we try to do that, we will fail and we will fall into sin. We cannot live perfectly righteous lives. Even after we are saved, we will still sin and we will still fail. It is only through faith in Jesus Christ that we can please God. And that is because through faith, the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ is given to us, is imputed to us, and works through us. Paul, again, writing to the Philippians, says, "Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but having a righteousness which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith." We can have no righteousness of our own, even as God's people. Despite our best intentions, despite our best efforts, despite renewing our promises to live for God, despite our joy and our enthusiasm, nothing we do in and of ourselves can be counted as righteous in God's eyes. The only righteousness that is perfect, the only righteousness that counts in God's eyes is the righteousness of Jesus Christ, the righteousness which comes to us through faith in Jesus Christ. Without faith in him, without this faith, nothing we do will ever please God. And without this faith, we cannot be seen as righteous in God's eyes. Every person who has ever followed God has failed to live a perfectly righteous life except one, except for Jesus Christ. And through faith in him, his righteousness, his perfect life of obedience is given to us. And at the cross, that righteousness, his righteousness, is given to us and becomes ours, and our failures and our sins are taken away, so that when God remembers us, he remembers the perfect righteousness of Jesus. And so when we fail to live for God, and we will frequently, we come back to the cross. So as we finish our time in the book of Nehemiah, there are, I think, to me at least, two things that stand out. One is the sinfulness of God's people, and the other is God's amazing goodness and faithfulness. And these two things, they are polar opposites, aren't they? They couldn't be further apart. We are utterly sinful, and God is utterly good. But even though these two things, even though our sinfulness and God's goodness are so far apart, it's good to remember the two of them together in the same thought. Charles Simeon was a minister in the Church of England in the 17 and 1800s. And after he'd been a Christian for 40 years or so, he summed up his faith in these words. He said, "There are but two objects that I have ever desired for these 40 years of being a Christian to behold. The one is my own vileness, my own sinfulness. And the other is the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And I've always thought that they should be viewed together. By this, I seek to be not only humble and thankful, but humbled in thankfulness before my God and Savior continually." We are, all of us, utterly sinful, utterly lost, utterly vile, lost without the grace of God. And even the most faithful of God's people will fail and will fall into sin. But whilst these failures can be disappointing, they should serve to increase our awe and our wonder and our joy at God's grace, that he would choose to save sinners like us. And as we are humbled by our failures, we can be all the more thankful for the cross